Do you ever wonder what went wrong with Star Fox? I mean, for a series so closely associated with Nintendo's best, the treatment it's received over the years is nothing short of staggering. From its trailblazing beginnings to its embarrassing dog days, I don't think there's ever been such an IP that nobody knows how to successfully handle. If the phrase lightning in a bottle ever took physical form, it'd appear as a fox accompanied by a bird, a bunny, and a toad. For God's sake, this was an IP that encapsulated the pure essence of graphical achievement, be it 16-bit Super FX or 64-bit polygonal all-range space combat. But over the years, creative hiccups have seen to degrading the perceived quality of such greatness, and these days Star Fox is associated with mediocre experimentation that should have never been attempted. It says a lot when a game character is better known for appearing in video games that were never theirs in the first place, and while you could make similar arguments for all of the other mistreated series Nintendo seemingly has no idea what to do with, it seems like Star Fox has arguably gotten it the worst. Like, all I'm saying is, sometimes it's better to have received no games at all in a 20-year time span when potential releases could tear your fanbase right down the middle. But how does one plot a timeline that details such unfortunate events? Easy. By returning to where it all began. The early days of the console wars were all about one thing: outclassing your competitor. And while there were like a million game consoles to choose from during the 1990s, the undisputed top dogs were none other than Nintendo and Sega. It was a video game arms race. Every corporate decision performed was done so with the express intent of gaining the upper hand and making the other guy look bad. Nintendo dominates the market with the 8-bit NES, so Sega creates the 16-bit Genesis. Nintendo releases the 16-bit SNES, and in a bit of a retrospective panic, Sega retaliates by unleashing their line of console accessories, the Sega CD and 32X. The thing with both of those is, not only was the hardware yet to be understood by developers and therefore treated a bit tech demo-y, but they were also costly add-ons deemed more or less unnecessary by the mainstream market. Nintendo, on the other hand, was reluctant to release such peripherals for the SNES. While projects like the ill-fated Nintendo PlayStation would come and go, the company maintained a strict reliance on the console's dedicated hardware alone. However, with a bit of trickery and outside-the-box thinking, they were able to turn out a hardware phenomenon that would go on to change the infrastructure of game design. Allow me to introduce the Super FX chip, Nintendo's secret weapon in bringing reliable 3D polygonal graphics to home consoles. Going by the development title of Mario, meaning mathematical Argonaut rotation and input-output, this baby began as a secret project between Nintendo and Argonaut Games. Both companies had collaborated before with the release of the Game Boy's Japanese exclusive X, a space combat simulator boasting 3D wireframe graphics that were so impressive, upon seeing them, Game Boy creator Gunpei Yokoi made it a priority to personally meet with Argonaut's team of developers. When you leave an impression on the guy who not only created the Game & Watch, but also the NES Zapper, controller, Rob the Robot, and came up with the modern cross design for D-pads, you know you've done something right. By 1993, Nintendo would approach Argonaut to create what would ultimately become the Super FX chip, an RISC-based processor that would work in conjunction with the SNES's pre-existing hardware to output games that utilized both 2D effects and 3D rendered polygonal objects. Only, unlike Sega's conspicuous console attachments, the Super FX chip would work secretly, independent of the console, instead being a part of the game's cartridge itself. Of course, this meant games that utilized the technology would come with a higher price tag, but as a wise man once said, a small price to pay for salvation. While a lot of this console wars stuff might seem irrelevant, maybe even a better fit for a completely different video, it's important as it would lead to the eventual creation of Star Fox, a marriage of ideas between the two companies that included callbacks to past Argonaut titles like Starglider and X, as well as brand new concepts from designers Shigeru Miyamoto and Katsuya Iguchi. To say this game was a success would probably be one of the biggest understatements a person can make. The advent of Star Fox was a pivotal moment in the history of game design, as for the first time, true 3D graphics were finally viable outside of arcade games, on a 16-bit system no less. Wireframe 3D had come and gone, sure, but this was the moment bits became polygons, free of PC or arcade hardware. It also succeeded in giving Nintendo a considerable lead over Sega, with the latter scrambling to produce a worthy competitor, which would eventually come in the form of the Sega Virtua processor, seen in the first console iteration of Virtua Racing, as well as the 32X. But we all know how that story ends. This joint venture between Nintendo and Argonaut resulted in a smash hit, with Star Fox quickly becoming one of the hottest titles on the Super Nintendo. These days, yeah, it looks like any other early 3D game, primitive and blocky, but that's what makes it great. It's art amidst limitation, from the pixelated mugshots of the respective team members to the almost paper airplane-like R-Wings. It's so much more than a simple flex of graphical prowess. Anyone could have released a game that looked like this back in the early 90s and raked in a ton of cash while being heralded as revolutionary, but it would have been devoid of any of the soul injected by Miyamoto and Iguchi. In fact, that happened quite a few times even on more advanced consoles, but funnily enough, never resulted in mass profit or praise. It was because of these two that the series became so distinct from any other sci-fi work. Conventions were broken, and the main cast was made up of animals, with numerous facets of Japanese folklore acting as inspiration for the project. This is why, aside from being thematically and visually distinct from other series like Mario and Zelda, Star Fox fits right alongside them, which should come as no surprise, as these two men are credited with creating not only some of the company's most successful IPs, but some of the most successful IPs in the history of video games. Damn near 30 years later, some of the more noticeable blemishes are glaring. Like, this game really slows down when there's a lot of action on the screen, and I mean it slows down, dropped inputs and all. You can't exactly blame it though. I mean, the SNES was designed with games like this in mind, so to be pushed to the limits and exhibit a bit of fatigue shouldn't come as much of a surprise. But more on that later. The success of Star Fox ensured multiple things, chief among them being a sequel, with Nintendo and Argonaut hard at work to produce a worthy follow-up. This, of course, meant pushing the boundaries even further, both refining and adding to the gameplay with new additions like non-linear progression, turn-based strategy, all-range 360-degree free roaming, and seamless air-to-ground combat. Because of this, the Super FX chip had to be reworked to deliver on such conditions, resulting in the creation of the Super FX2, which had considerably more memory than its predecessor and ran twice as fast, at a blistering speed of 21 MHz. It was so impressive that at the Winter CES show of 1995, a guy actually attempted to make off with the game's demo cart, but was promptly arrested and charged with felony grand larceny. Can you imagine being the guy who tried to steal Star Fox 2? Or any other video game for that matter? The advent of the Super FX2 also meant more for Nintendo than just adding onto the Star Fox name. With it, they were able to port the FPS phenomenon Doom to the SNES with mixed results. They were also able to implement it into their second Mario World title, Yoshi's Island, making full use of its potential for the game's use of sprite stretching and scaling. Unfortunately for Star Fox 2, its time was not long for this cruel, bleak world, and by mid-1995, at 95% overall development completion, it was swiftly canned. Now, there are a lot of myths and snub pieces aimed at Shigeru Miyamoto himself, claiming that he was for some reason jealous of this game and the advancements Argonaut had made, so he constantly snubbed them with minor creative restrictions and eventually canceled the whole thing outright. Obviously, this is all hearsay and is not backed up by any official sources, nor anyone with credible experience on the project, so take all of that with a massive grain of salt. Sure, it is a bit fishy fishy that he was insistent on the game never seeing the light of day, instead urging consumers to move on and enjoy new Star Fox games made by him, but the fact of the matter is, Star Fox 2 was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. See, this was the mid-90s, and there was this little-known Nintendo product soon to release. Maybe you've heard of it, called the... As advanced for a SNES game as Star Fox 2 was, it didn't stand a snowball's chance in hell of outcompeting releases on more advanced hardware like the Sega Saturn or Sony PlayStation, and Nintendo knew that fact all too well. The interesting thing is, Star Fox 2 was never formally cancelled. Nintendo saw to completing the game's development, even going as far as finishing its localization and putting it through QA testing. This is backed up by Argonaut programmer Dylan Cuthbert himself. There was just a lot of confusion back then. Despite all this, Star Fox 2 didn't remain in the vault forever. An incomplete build of it saw a quiet leak onto the internet back in the late 90s, and come September of 2017, it was officially released as part of the SNES Classic Edition. Humorously, it's now considered to be the best-selling Star Fox game, as it being a new release exclusive to the SNES Classic means that it shares in the overall sales of the system at a total of over 5 million units sold in 2018. Who'd have ever thought that would be the case? This was a large point of interest for many, myself included. In fact, yours truly made a day one purchase with the express intent of making a video on Star Fox 2. Obviously that never happened, but something has finally come of it. This was also the point in which the game was heavily picked apart for being a 1995 SNES title with considerably outdated graphics and minor hiccups like slowdown. I understand that IGN is by no means ever to be taken seriously, but pinging a Super Nintendo game from the mid-90s for having old graphics and performance issues? What, do you also get surprised when you touch hot water and it burns? Personally, I think Star Fox 2 is awesome. It's just as ambitious now as it was 25 years ago, introducing many characters and mechanics that would go on to become future series staples, and lends to some interesting what-if scenarios. What if this saw a release back then? How much would it have affected Star Fox 64? We'll never know. Speaking of... The details following the quiet cancellation of Star Fox 2 are a little bit fuzzy, but what's clear is that Argonaut was out and Nintendo was all in. See, it's no secret that Nintendo has a bit of an issue when it comes to mistreating their non-first-party developers. Argonaut was no exception. They put forth a ton of work that allowed Nintendo to ascend the ladder of innovation, and were just as quickly dropped without a second thought. Yeah, it was just business, and the contractual obligation between the two was up, but come on. Put yourself in Argonaut's place. You'd be pretty pissed too. Of course, there are the debacles regarding whether or not Nintendo stole ideas from them, but that isn't the point. In fact, it's slander waiting to happen. And I'm a broke-ass bitch, so not even gonna touch it. Star Fox 64 was hands down the pinnacle of console graphical achievement in the year 1997. Not only was it 64 bits with an impressive amount of variation between its levels, but it was a fully voiced game with over 4 megabytes of speech data. Now, that might not sound like much. In fact, when looking at the grand scheme of things, it isn't. Compared to titles on contemporary systems like Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation, there's really no contest. However, it's the format in which Star Fox 64 operates that makes this a talking point. See, during development for the Nintendo 64, a crucial decision was made to utilize cartridges, or game packs, instead of the CD-ROM format. This greatly limited N64 games, as the storage space allotted to them was vastly inferior to that of other systems. Granted, it was mostly third-party titles that suffered from this the most, but it was a major hurdle that had to be overcome, and if we're being totally honest, hurt the console a good bit. This didn't stop Star Fox 64 from becoming a breakout hit. While not as heralded as Mario 64 with its wholly open-ended exploration gameplay and seamless evolution from 2D to 3D, it proved to be quite a heavy hitter in Nintendo's arsenal. It was flashy, it was quotable, and most important, it was fun. It successfully took the better aspects of both SNES games and built upon the core concept while being careful not to go too far. Let's not forget that it also had the pleasure of introducing the Nintendo 64 Rumble Pack, which for the first time allowed players to receive vibrational feedback from video games. Lots of people credit Sony with the advent of controller vibration, but forget that the first iteration of the PlayStation controller shipped with neither it nor analog sticks. Those were released with the DualShock. Ask anyone about Star Fox, and chances are 64 will come up at the top. It was seriously that big of a deal, selling a grand total of over 4 million copies since its release, 300,000 of which during its first 5 days on the market. And that's all without even mentioning that the game was vital to birthing modern meme culture with its more than over-the-top one-liners. Though, depending on your tastes, that can be either good or bad. Things were looking up for Fox and his pals, but little did anyone know of the future to come. Do you ever wonder what went wrong with Rare? Just kidding, that's worthy of its own video. If Nintendo was a mafia don, Rare would have been its consigliere. During the heyday of the NES, SNES, and N64, these two were a force to be reckoned with. If you saw a game with this followed by this, you immediately knew you were in for some good shit. By the time of 3D graphics, they were finally allowed to unleash their grand vision without having to worry about previous constraints. Banjo-Kazooie was successful in legitimizing the 3D collectathon platformer genre, and GoldenEye 007, despite its now unmistakable issues, proved that consoles could be a viable haven for first-person shooters, and with a little help from a game a few years down the line, almost become a genre in and of itself. It was also clear that they were interested in treading previously foreign waters. By the year 1999, they had begun work on an entirely new action-adventure title known as Dinosaur Planet. Slated for release on the N64, the game would have seen brother-sister duo Saber and Crystal, two entirely new characters, on a quest to save the titular dinosaur planet from the tyranny of the evil General Scales. This would all soon change, however, after the project had caught the eye of none other than Shigeru Miyamoto, who, impressed with the overall idea, noticed similarities between the character Saber and Fox McCloud. Following a proposal to wholly change the project to become a new Star Fox game, Rare quickly jumped at the opportunity, and it was soon decided that it would instead release on the GameCube. Now, whether or not you hate Star Fox Adventures, you have to admit, it was very divisive. Personally, I've come to appreciate it. There's a lot of charm sprinkled throughout, and the entire thing screams early 2000s Nintendo. Still, I'm not gonna act like it's a perfect game. The majority of it plays like a simplified version of Ocarina of Time with lots of hand-holding, and there are a ton of character inclusions and story moments that'll leave you scratching your head. To this day, there is a large number of Star Fox fans who hate this game because it's different. And it is. When you think of Star Fox, you don't imagine a game that plays like Zelda and has dinosaurs with a heavy emphasis on magic, despite being set in a science fiction universe with space battles and mercenaries. It's because of that mind frame that this game suffered upon release. Sure, it was and remains to be a graphically impressive demonstration of the power the GameCube was capable of, and critics were generally favorable towards it, but a lot of the core Star Fox fanbase was left disappointed. This is seen nowhere better than the game's sales, and I'm by no means advocating that money made is indicative of a product's overall worth. However, comparing Star Fox Adventure sales to Star Fox 64's, it's clear that players voted with their wallets. You know, before that became a trendy thing to do. It's a real shame too. This is a quality game when you view it as its own thing, and was also the last time Rare would collaborate with Nintendo, at least for large-scale console games, as this was right around the time they began their tenure under Microsoft, therefore canning the possibility of any future endeavors. For a while anyway. This meant that whosoever would be in charge of the next game would have to keep things a little bit more familiar, and it was decided that Nintendo would partner with Namco due to their history of developing aerial flight simulators like the Ace Combat games. This endeavor, which would go on to become known as Star Fox Assault, made its first public appearance during E3 2003, which showcased some of its newer gameplay mechanics and rather impressive graphics given the hardware it was running on. However, the entire thing drew a lukewarm reception from the audience, as reportedly many of them took to booing it. I also found this footage of an old build. I'm not exactly sure when it's from, but it has some of the most humorous temporary voice acting I've ever heard.
It appears we made it in time.
Yes, sir.
I had no idea so much of the Andros army remained intact.
Most are merely mercenaries in it for the money.
They're pretty strong for an unorganized band of mercenaries.
Oikony is behind the uprising.
That's why they attacked us.
Just wait till I get my hands on him.
Star Fox Assault would go on to release early 2005, and acted as a return to form for many aspects. There was a greater emphasis on pure vehicle gameplay, most of its score was made up of orchestral recordings of the classic Star Fox 64 tracks, and the story kept in line with its predecessors, seeing Star Fox team defending the Lilat system once again. That isn't to say it's a carbon copy of the games before it though. Along with R-Wing and Landmaster gameplay comes actual on-foot exploration, where Fox uses an arsenal of weapons to defeat enemies. However, this wasn't enough to save the game in the long run. Despite performing better with critics and fans alike, even going as far as becoming a player's choice title, its sales never officially exceeded any more than 1.08 million units sold. And even then, that number isn't certain, as Miyamoto himself would claim that it, along with the game that came out after, didn't even break a million. This is especially puzzling because Assault was about as close to a natural evolution of the traditional Star Fox formula as you could get. Still, there are a few aspects that mar its better points of interest. One of my favorite decisions being introducing a darker storyline where characters actually suffer horrible deaths is given less value by the game's kooky attitude. A potential mentor-brother relationship between Fox and Wolf is introduced, however contributes little and holds almost no value by the end of the game. It feels almost like the initial vision for Assault was to not only advance the gameplay, but also the story, introducing higher stakes and more fleshed out characters. What did it give us instead? I'd be willing to chalk up the lackluster performance to the GameCube's overall sales, but what most people forget is that in spite of performing worse than the Xbox and PlayStation 2, there was a massive player base on the GameCube. 22 million worldwide units is no slouch, especially when you take into account that the leading console at the time was considered an unexpected phenomenon that nobody could have predicted. Was the issue as simple as nobody being interested in Star Fox anymore? Only time would tell. While amicable, the split between Nintendo and Argonaut left the latter floundering for quite some time. Despite going on to develop classics like the Croc games and iNinja, their successes, no matter how commendable, paled in comparison to their work on Star Fox. October 1st of 2004 would unfortunately see the company go defunct, ending in not a bang but a god-awful whimper with the Catwoman movie tie-in game. Argonaut would only disband in name, however. Two of its ex-employees, being Jamie Walker and Sefton Hill, soon found themselves establishing a new company under the name of Rocksteady Studios. Yeah, the same people who made Star Fox made the Batman Arkham series. Guess that explains why those games are so good. But this wouldn't be the only development, as the previously mentioned Dylan Cuthbert would also stake a new claim by founding Q Games, specializing in development for portable titles and quickly joining with Nintendo to produce a new Star Fox title. In a way, this meant Argonaut was back where they belonged, and before anyone knew it, Star Fox Command hit store shelves for the Nintendo DS. I played this game as a kid. For the most part, I thought it was aight. but I also remember that it was filled with a ton of bullshit. Being on the DS was probably enough to tip you off, but for those of you who aren't exactly on the same page as the rest of us, most of this game is built around utilizing the touchscreen. And I know, touch controls or any other gimmicky implementation aren't inherently bad. However, this game is unique in that just about every action for the vehicles is tied to performing some arbitrary movement with the stylus. Steering? Touchscreen. Barrel rolling? Touchscreen. Even shooting bombs and doing somersaults requires you to hit a virtual button on the touchscreen. The only thing that uses the physical DS buttons is shooting lasers, and even then that's done about as liberally as possible, with every one of them, including L, R, and the D-pad itself, performing the action. It also attempts to bring back some of the not yet revisited concepts from 2, such as open-ended gameplay with turn-based strategy elements, but unlike the game it's attempting to spiritually revitalize, adds unnecessary restrictions like time limits and levels. On paper, this sounds fine enough. The looming element of a ticking timer adds considerable urgency that cuts down on needless dilly-dallying, but in execution, it messes with the fundamentals of the game, as most of the timers are so short, it causes the entire thing to feel like it's constantly in an arcade time attack mode. Add to this the inclusion of different level objectives which range from collecting MacGuffins to outright fighting bosses, and it feels like every move you make needs to be absolutely perfect, otherwise you'll run out of time and have to restart. There are other issues not exclusive to the gameplay, like this game's story is all over the place, with characters that only resemble their past selves in appearance, because for whatever reason, they've all regressed personality-wise. Fox is a needy crybaby, Crystal is somehow even more obnoxious, and Wolf is suddenly a good guy. So much for those blurred lines in Star Fox Assault, huh? There's also an absurd amount of 9 endings that range from serviceable to downright bizarre, and the cherry on top is that none of them are canon, so why even waste your time? It's enough of a drudge playing through this mess once or twice, so I can't possibly imagine why you'd want to do it almost 10 times. You could make an argument that it adds replayability by requiring you to beat the game once and then travel to different paths, but 64 had already done all of that almost a decade earlier and managed to be enjoyable the entire way through, and it only had 2 endings. In short, Command was an unfortunate experiment. It released on a device that simply couldn't deliver on a convenient way of playing it simply because of its shoehorned-in control scheme, and the story is mediocre at best, with the majority of it feeling like a glorified fanfiction. As you might expect, it continued the downward spiral of the series, with its calculated sales not even exceeding 500,000 units, and for 5 years, 5 long years, the series would descend into shadow, leaving fans with only memories of how the name Star Fox used to be synonymous with quality and joy. Then came the advent of the 3DS in 2011, and with it, Star Fox 64 3D, co-developed again by Nintendo and Q Games. It was everything fans wanted. It was what we needed. It was a remake of a game we'd already played years prior, but still, 64 3D was a massive success. Sure, it was a 3DS game, but was for the most part faithful to its original iteration. The extent of newly included gimmicks was limited to 3D, which is a no-brainer, and also a toggleable gyro aiming mode, neither of which were mandatory to the game. Any other inclusions were done so as to add quality of life improvements, like 3DS or 64 mode, the former of which tunes the gameplay and objectives to complement the newfound additions, and the latter which stays true to the original console experience. Add to all of that newly recorded voice lines, updated graphics that still look great, and the ability to save in between levels. All in all, it was exactly what the series needed to be revitalized, and it didn't even break 1 million sales. The repercussions of past flops were hitting at full force. The majority of people had grown wary of anything with the name Star Fox attached because of how poorly the series had been performing. I guess it also didn't help that the game released at an early point in the 3DS's lifespan. I can recall a lot of people doubting the thing because of what it was and its name. I guarantee if it had released just a bit later, 64 3D would have probably performed better. And as if to keep with the series tradition, Star Fox would yet again go into a weird form of hibernation, with no new games being discussed or released. In this time, Nintendo would release their latest console, officially kicking off the 8th generation with the Nintendo Wii U. However, Star Fox was notably absent for the duration of the system's lifespan. Sure, games that featured components of the series like Super Smash Bros. Wii U would come and go, but dedicated titles were a no-show. In fact, it wasn't until right around the end of the console's run in 2016 that anything would be produced. However, a joint venture between Nintendo and Platinum Games would end that period of silence, with the highly anticipated Star Fox Zero. Now, the failures of Star Fox Zero are well known, so I'm gonna do my best to not burden you with them for too long. Let's begin with the sales. To date, this is the lowest selling Star Fox game of all time. That's right, Star Fox Command just barely beats this game. Wow. And though critics were mostly pleased, everyone else was massively let down. To put it simply, this game was a far cry from what players wanted and what the series needed. For all of its redeemable qualities like presentation and story, no matter how much it borrows from 64 before it, it is equally outweighed by its failures. The core of the issues is the game's main gimmick. See, the entire thing from the controls to even its dialogue is done with a heavy reliance on the gamepad. That isn't to say this implementation is the root of all its problems though, because certain things like characters speaking through it adds a great deal of immersion to the experience. However, the biggest flaw bar none is tied directly to it, that being the motion controls. It's almost as if this game was made for people with individual control over their eyes, with the main flying taking place on the TV and the precision cockpit aiming on the gamepad. You'd think such an addition might be at the very least fun, but in execution adds a great deal of unneeded complication as you have to constantly shift your focus between the two so you can avoid being killed on the TV and try your best to rack up some points with the gyro aiming. The all-range segments suffer from this the worst, being in a wide open area filled with a ton of enemies that attack you from behind, and having to awkwardly aim the gamepad to find them is so obnoxiously bad that I have to wonder just who thought this was fun. After all, this was overseen by Miyamoto himself, whose ethic for designing games is based around what he finds enjoyable. So I have to ask, is the man secretly a sadist? This was apparently done so people watching the gameplay could be just as enthralled as the player, but that nonsense aside, micromanaging myself isn't what comes to mind when I think of video games, much less Star Fox. And the worst part is, I can't tell if it made it in because nobody was brave enough to challenge Miyamoto, or because he was so sure of himself that he wouldn't have it any other way. Maybe both of them at once? I don't know, I'm not gonna say that the man himself has a misplaced ego, because he is in fact one of the most influential game designers of all time, a claim easily backed up by his extensive contributions of successful ideas and IPs to the industry, but this was far from his finest hour. I almost feel like this game is the reason why he hasn't been given the reins for any major titles, at least without having to work alongside someone else. This was the last Nintendo game he directed, with following titles like The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey, both installments in series he created, being under the care of different people entirely. And guess what? Those are some of Nintendo's most successful titles of all time. Maybe we've come to a point where someone else needs to take over for Star Fox. I'm not saying to can Shiggy entirely, I mean he's worthy of giving some input every now and again, but someone else needs to be made head honcho simply so the series can be viewed from a fresh point of view and evolve accordingly. I guess Star Fox is relegated to guest appearances in Smash Bros. And games like Starlink now, which is funny since he's been crashing games he has no right to crash since Star Fox Adventures. God, it's just painful to watch. Like, I have nothing against these crossovers, but when they're the only quality products with these characters, it makes you wonder what's really keeping them afloat in the grand scheme of things. Like, how many kids out there see Fox McCloud or Falco and associate them with being the two fast guys who throw shines in Smash Bros? Don't even get me started on Wolf. It's almost as bad as Captain Falcon being the weird guy who looks like Bible Man and Falcon punches people. Only Star Fox hasn't been thrown to the wayside for nearly 2 decades. If you're looking for true quality, I'd highly recommend checking out A Fox in Space, a fan-made cartoon right here on YouTube that takes influence from the SNES games and tells a more mature, gritty version of the story we all know and love. The only issue is, you might have to wait a few years in between episodes, but hey, what are you gonna do? I know it's a bit early, but I feel like saving Star Fox might come down to the fans. It's been long speculated that Nintendo is just about done with the series following its poor sales, which is funny since their inability to output a game that isn't bogged down by stupid-ass design choices is the direct cause of said plight, but only time will tell. So please, try to understand that my frustration comes not from a place of hate nor anger, but from a place of love and longing that we can get back to a point where Star Fox encapsulates Nintendo's success and endeavor and ingenuity, without its sole focus being on wooing players with unnecessary gimmicks. Because, as we all know, Star Fox's true strength comes from its heart, being the lovable characters and story about underdogs saving the day, so that a new game can be revealed and we can be excited for what's to come, and not be wary because of past failures.